Introductions. I've got two. First is 25 RS 1109, and that is a fix to advanced ballot applications. It's mainly a little font change because we required 14-point font. We realized after we'd passed that bill, I think it's been a couple years ago, it's too big, it creates problems. So it's fixing that. Any questions or objections to introduction of that bill? Seeing none, that's introduced. The second one is 25 RS 0563, and that is in regards to judicial selection. Any questions or objections to the introduction of that bill? Seeing none, that bill is introduced. Okay, committee, today we have a hearing on Senate Bill 105. And this is requiring the governor to appoint a person to fill vacancies in the office of the U.S. Senator, State Treasurer, and Commissioner of Insurance from a list of names approved by the legislature. And for a bill brief, we will turn to Jason to give us an overview.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 105 addresses when there are vacancies in the office of a U.S. Senator or in the state elected offices of State Treasurer and Commissioner of Insurance. Under the current law, if a vacancy occurs for a U.S. Senator, then state statute directs the governor to appoint a person to temporarily fill the vacancy until the next election for members of the U.S. House of Representatives. And so then at that next election, you have an election for an individual to fill the remainder of that U.S. Senate term at that point. Senate Bill 105 would keep that temporary filling of the vacancy in place, but changes it so that the governor must make that temporary appointment from a list of 3 individuals who are approved by the legislature. And so it provides a slate of potential candidates for appointment to the governor, and the governor would select one of those 3 individuals. Likewise, when there are vacancies in the office of State Treasurer or Commissioner of Insurance, the governor makes an appointment of a person to serve the remainder of the term of office for those offices. And likewise, Senate Bill 105 would direct the governor to select an appointee from a list of 3 individuals who are approved by the legislature. The bill also requires that any person appointed to any of those 3 offices to fill those vacancies must be a resident of Kansas and must be registered with the same political party as the office holder who is vacating the office, who was elected at the last general election. So the appointee stays with the same political party as the outgoing office holder. The sections 2 through 4 of the bill provide the procedure for how those 3 names are identified and then submitted to the governor. Within 10 calendar days of a vacancy occurring, there will be a joint committee on vacancy appointments established by the appointment of the members of the committee. The committee consists of 12 legislators appointed by the various leadership offices of the Senate and the House. You can see that breakdown on page 2 of the bill, starting on line 5. At the first meeting of the committee must occur within 30 days after the vacancy has occurred. The president or the president's designee would serve as chair of the committee. The Speaker of the House or the Speaker's designee would serve as vice chair of the committee. The committee is charged to review the candidates for appointment. They conduct 1 or more public hearings. At the conclusion of their deliberations, the committee would introduce a concurrent resolution in each chamber recommending 3 individuals as candidates. Each house must consider those resolutions within 10 days and either adopt the resolution or direct the committee to reconvene and recommend a different slate of candidates. In the event there is a vacancy that occurs outside of the regular session of the legislature, and the committee would then conduct its work and submit a report with its recommendations directly to the governor with those three names. This would go into effect on publication in the Kansas Register, so it would be effective sooner than July 1st of this year if enacted. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Jason. Committee, any questions? Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Jason, for your work on this. I just want to get an understanding. This was a process that was previously used in Kansas, is that correct?
No, prior to the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the state legislatures would select their U.S. Senate representative, and they would do so. In my research, it looked like in Kansas, they would convene a joint session of the two houses to vote on a individual to be named as the U.S. Senate senator for the state of Kansas is how that process worked. And so in respect that the U.S. Senator was approved by the legislature. Yes, this is similar, but I didn't see anything in my research about a joint committee making recommendations to the legislature. It was simply legislative approval.
Thank you, Jason, and I appreciate the chairman's work on this. I know he's done diligent work. So when did we start, the governor start being a part of that process?
So the 17th Amendment provides that you have an election to fill a vacancy, except that the legislature of a state can empower its governor to make a temporary appointment to fill that position. I would have to look at the current statute to see when it was enacted, to see exactly when we began empowering the governor to make that appointment, but I can get that to the committee here real quickly.
That'd be great, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is legislation that's much needed.
Thank you. Thank you. And by the way, the 17th Amendment, I think, was 1913, as I recall, or maybe 1918, somewhere.
1918.
Right around in there is when I recall. And again, this is for filling a temporary vacancy. You know, this is not usurping the natural election process that would take place when the next senatorial election comes up. Any other questions, committee? Senator Falscadeau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, did we look at this legislation last year?
There were bills introduced last session on filling a U.S. Senate vacancy. And so, yes, there were some different proposals and those bills concerning, I think, again, providing a slate of candidates to the governor to select for filling the vacancy.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, Jason, so if this legislation were to pass, the list, it would be three individuals that the governor would select. Tell me again who that three would be in that selection process.
The three individuals must meet the requirements under the bill to fill the vacancy, a resident of Kansas and the same political party as the outgoing office holder. Other than that, it would be three individuals who were recommended by the joint committee, and if in session, part of the resolution adopted by both chambers and sent to the governor, and so the governor would choose one of those three.
And to be specific, because of the way the 17th Amendment is written, and because of our Kansas Constitution, we cannot force a legislature to come back when we're not in session. We can call by 2/3 of the legislature to come back to special session to approve, but we can't force that in statute. The governor can call, or the legislature with 2/3, but to avoid any constitutional issues, this was written in such that the nominating committee would propose those names to the governor without the legislature approval when we're not in session, unless we were to call ourselves back. And so that it gets to be a little troublesome when you're writing a bill like this, but that was one of the considerations. But when we're in session, then there's an approval process that goes through the legislature, and those names are submitted, or it's submitted as a report to the governor when we're out of session, and has nothing. And the governor does not play a role with the insurance commissioner and the treasurer. Is that correct, Jason? I believe that's correct. And this-
So the bill provides the same procedure for filling vacancies for those two offices, as those two offices are created statutorily. Those statutes are amended. The other two statewide elected offices of the Attorney General and the Secretary of State are constitutional state offices, and the filling of those offices is provided for under the state constitution and would require a state constitutional amendment to change that process.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to understand that if the legislature would want to choose to come back into session, that this doesn't preclude that, correct?
No. If a vacancy occurs and the legislature, either the governor calls the legislature back into session, or if 2/3 of the members sign a petition to call a special session, then a special session will be called, and then the joint committee would submit a concurrent resolution within that special session to the two chambers for adoption.
Thank you.
Senator Clifford and then Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Page 2, Section 210 under B contemplates the committee not being established. And just doing the math on the 90 days, that would be if someone vacated who was an incumbent, in October for the rest of the year, or someone might be elected to that office and then die or.
That one's a hard one to understand. Jason and I went back and forth on this. I'll let Jason
Thank you, Mr.
explain
Chairman.
it. Thank you, Senator Clifford.
Yes, that provision, I believe, is intended to address a very narrow situation in which the office is vacated, but there's an imminent election for that office, and in which case, I believe the policy put forth by this would be, instead of having the joint committee go through the work of recommending candidates for appointment, simply allowing the election process to go forward and select the next senator, and the position remains vacant in those situations, unless the senator who is an incumbent is up for election and vacates the office, in which case, even if they're elected, there's still a vacancy, and the joint committee should proceed in that case and put up a slate of candidates. And so it's trying to address that very narrow circumstance in an election year in which you may or may not have an incumbent senator or office holder running for re-election and vacating the office within that time period in the same year.
Follow up, please. And I recognize the narrowness of that, but what if a new person is elected to that Senate seat and in December they die of a heart attack? What happens then? They're not an incumbent, right? Is that not contemplated by this section, or is there a different process?
So so that would go into, the joint committee would convene in that case because the incumbent who vacated the office was not reelected to the office. It was a new individual who then, under your circumstances, would not be able to take office. You would have the joint committee convene in that situation, I believe, to put forth a slate of candidates.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, Mr.
Sure.
Chair.
Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was complicated, Jason, because, you can do a lot of what-ifs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So on the bottom of page 1, you've got the joint committee on vacancy appointments will be established, and then you have the list of who would be appointed to that. Is there anything, and I've read it as quickly as I can, is there anything that restricts some legislator who was on that joint committee from lobbying for themselves to be selected as one of the 3 candidates? Speaker of the House, the Senate President, one of the legislators. Is there anything, I'm thinking of the ethics of it?
No, there is no restriction on any current member of the legislature being one of the 3 names recommended by the joint committee, including legislators who are on the joint committee.
And so, thank you. And so I would just call that to the committee's attention. We may want to narrow that a little bit, perhaps, because shenanigans always comes to mind. Is that a good word, shenanigans?
Yeah, I mean, we could consider some potential language on something like that. Perhaps if somebody was considered, they would have to recuse themselves from that committee and then be replaced by another appointment or something like that. I mean, that's something we could work out in the amendment process, I think. Any other questions? Senator Blue?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jason, is this a standing committee, or the committee selection process trigger if there is a vacancy?
It would not be a standing committee. It's a special joint committee that would only be appointed and established when there is a vacancy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Senator Tyson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there anything that refers to party affiliation?
Well, yes, to be on the list of 3, you must be of the same political party as the vacating office holder.
I just wanted to confirm that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure thing. And you also have to be a resident of Kansas. You also have to be a member of that party for 6 years. And then qualify for the office.
Yes.
To be held. So those are the qualifications you have to have.
Yes, that's correct. I'm sorry, I didn't mention the 6 years of the same political party registration.
Right. And then also, the other requirement is that each congressional district have at least 2 representatives, so that we get everybody across the state represented. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Jason. Oh, Senator Francisco, do you have one?
Thank you. You did just allude to each of the state's congressional districts shall be represented. How would that happen if?
That's required in the committee makeup. So as the appointments happen, I would imagine the leadership of that committee would have to be cognizant of who is being represented. When they make those appointments, there's appointments from the leadership basically, but they would probably, we kind of stay silent on some of that because if you try to get into the weeds, it gets too difficult other than just the fact that we want a good representation across the state from the congressional districts.
Thank you, but I don't know that there's an order. We could say in order. And then the other question, you have 10 calendar days. We always hope this doesn't happen over the end of the year holidays. But that situation could be.
There are all sorts of variables. And, our biggest concern is, number one, we don't want a long period of time where there's a vacancy in that U.S. Senate seat for balance of power issues, but we want to do it expeditiously. So it's always a balance trying to reach those two.
So I will consider calendar days or business days as we look at that.
Okay. All righty. And Senator Faustido.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason, currently, how is this process? How are those vacancies filled?
It's just a governor appointment.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other questions, committee? Thank you, Jason. We have testimony up first from our State Treasurer, Stephen Johnson, as our first oral proponent. Thank you, Mr. Treasurer, for coming today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thanks for your work and consideration of the bill. The testimony that I have written is the most concise and complete points that I'd have, just to add a little color and not take much of your time. I think it's just a more robust process to be able to consider something different in the people that we would look at to fill those vacancies when they occur, without comment on any administration. I'm sure there are administrations that we would be somewhat comfortable making that decision, administrations we might not be comfortable making that decision. Then in particular, as you look at the continuity of the offices, certainly the balance of power issue on the Senate is there, but as you look to some of the offices, so for the Treasurer, Insurance Commissioner, the ability to have some continuity in the staff that are there as that continues to work, depending on the timing of that vacancy. You do see a turnover when there's a change through that, and I think looking at who's able to make that appointment, being a little more robust in the set of folks that we would look at to fill the vacancy, and the continuity of operating the office are just some of the things that I would be excited about for the bill, and appreciate the committee's attention to the details of how to actually make it happen. So thanks for the work and the chance to be here. I'm happy to stand for questions, although you have many questions better than those that I would have.
Hey, committee, any questions for the treasurer? Senator Fascadeau.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a question, but I just have to say thank you. I found $200.
Oh, good. I would encourage many members of the committee to do a quick check, and Tom and Dondi are awesome to work with on unclaimed property.
And
So
I
thank you.
reposted your
Yes.
posts on
Okay.
Facebook, but people didn't believe me. They
Well,
didn't
thanks for
believe
finding
me.
it, and thanks for sharing the story. Just making
Thank
people
you.
aware is great. Thank you.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, and thank you. I understand and particularly appreciate that idea of the staff within the office. That makes a lot of sense. Do you have any concerns about the makeup of the 12 members of the committee, and 10 of them being from a majority party and only 2 from a minority party, in that situation where we always hope that perhaps the state treasurer might be of the minority party?
So I would have, given that the bill also directs that whoever is replacing is of the same party, I think reduces the partisan concern. So you'd be looking for those members that you could most agree on from within that, and I'd hope that that would limit it to some degree, but would certainly respect the decision of the committee on how that makeup would best work.
Any other questions? Seeing none, I know you've got to scoot to another meeting. Thank you for hanging out here and helping us out. Committee, we have written testimony for the Attorney General, also Wendy Bengesser, National Committee woman of Kansas Republican Party, and Dale Inyart, a private citizen. We have no oral in-person opponent testimony, but as you can see, there are 3 people who have submitted that. And we've got neutral testimony in person from Clay Barker, our Secretary of State. I'm sure this will be the more robust part of the conversation. And Clay, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clay Barker, General Counsel's Kansas Secretary of State. And Secretary Schwab instructed us on this bill. And by the way, the House has a similar version on the floor, starting in just a few minutes, that he believes it's the legislator's prerogative to decide how to structure this bill, and instructed us to provide input on sort of the mechanics and implications of different parts of it. And the way we see it is for the insurance commissioner and the treasurer, and in my testimony I gave a quick history. We haven't had an insurance commissioner vacancy in at least a century. We've had 4 treasurer vacancies in probably the last 20 years. If I could go down it really quick just to show you what happens is, Sally Thompson in 1998, then Lynn Jenkins, Ron Estes, and Jake LaTurner all left to go to Congress, and then they were replaced. The way the state law currently is, and this is maintained in this bill, is whoever is picked as the replacement, whether it's in the 4th year or the 1st year, just finishes the term. So to take it to kind of an extreme, just to show you, if someone was sworn in as treasurer, then tripped on the stairs of the Capitol and died, whoever's picked the next day to be treasurer would finish off all 4 years. There's no special election in the middle like for state senators or county officials. And if that's the legislature's decision, that the secretary's fine with that. The U.S. Senate, though, is a little bit different. And I'll start with the 17th Amendment has 2 parts to it. It says, 1, the vacancy must be filled by an election, but doesn't give any timing on that. And then it says the legislature may grant to its chief executive, the governor, the authority to appoint a temporary U.S. senator. And the way that's been interpreted is if the legislature has the power to give that choice to the governor, the legislature can put limits and constraints on it. It's their prerogative. So right now, 13 states fill the U.S. Senate vacancy with a special election, a one-time only U.S. Senate election. 5, that's all they do. 8 have the governor do a temporary and then an immediate special election. 37 states, the governor has the authority to appoint a temporary, and then they fill the position at the next general election, so along with all the other elections. Now, 6 states, the state party of the vacant senator gets to give the governor suggestions, 3, and the governor picks one. In 3 states, the governor just has to pick a replacement from the same party. 1 state, Utah, the legislature gives the governor 3 choices, and that's somewhat what this bill is based on. And then Connecticut, the governor picks whoever they want, but then the legislature has to ratify it with 2/3 majority. So you can see there's a lot of variations out there. And Senator Tyson, in answer to your question, the state law about replacing a U.S. senator was adopted in 1927, and I looked last night somewhat, and I didn't see anything before that, but there must have been because we've had vacancies since then. And in the last century, Kansas has had 4 U.S. Senate vacancies. 1 went to become vice president, 2 died, and then Bob Dole resigned to run for president. Now, the concern the secretary has, and it's not about the committee structure to pick the replacement or recommend to the governor, that's again up to you, is the language from the 1927 law, which is incorporated in this bill, says that the senator will be replaced, the vacancy will be filled at the time of the next election of representatives or Congress. That means the even year election following the vacancy. That's it. There's no other timing provision in there. And you have to think about this. What would happen is if the vacancy occurred in, say, April, governor appoints a temporary, all the candidates interested in senator will start checking with donors, and if they have support, they file on June 1, primary election, general election, and they fill the vacancy. But if the vacancy occurred in, say, September, the way this law is written is we would have to fill that vacancy at an election just a month later. And there's no time to go through the process of willowing it down to a Republican and a Democrat, maybe an independent, and getting names on the ballot, getting the military ballots out. And that timing problem has been in the statute for a century. Luckily, the 4 people who resigned or died, it happened early enough in the process that that problem was not triggered. It was triggered a little bit, if any of you remember, when Sheila Fromm was appointed to the Kansas Senate and Sam Brownback ran against her, is Bob Dole resigned effective June 11, which was the day after the filing deadline. It was June 10 back then, and thought she was safe for the next 2.5 years. And unfortunately, Governor Graves did not get good legal counsel on this because the Attorney General at the time and the Secretary of State said, no, it doesn't work that way for Senate vacancies. There is no time limit. So Sam Brownback could file after the filing deadline and was still allowed to run for election. That happened early enough in the process he could still do the primary in general. So the Secretary's concern is he recommends that we put some date cutoff in this bill. It says if the vacancy happens before this date, you go through the normal election process. If it happens after, you have to wait for the second general election because you're too close to the one coming up. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll stand for any questions on the timing.
Thank you, Clay. And that is existing law that's been in case. It's, we actually discovered this in the last day or 2. Yep. And so, yeah, committee, any questions?
If I could add, Mr. Chair, if you remember when Mike Pompeo resigned and there were some laws about replacing a congressman, which hadn't happened since the 1950s, the legislature had to jump through hoops to revise that law to make it consistent. And that's what we're afraid might happen here.
And there's a lot of different variables that could happen in that time frame. Would it be more efficient to, if there's a vacancy occurs, turn the decision, again, form the nominating committee, but allow that committee to work with the Secretary of State on the timing? If it's too close to a general election, they could, I don't know. It's just a thought I had.
Senator, there's a lot of options, and Secretary Schwab told us to work with the Senate on anything you consider and just give pros and cons and make sure the implications are thought through. But so far, we've gone a century and avoided triggering this timing issue. Yeah. But it could. Yeah.
In committee, I do intend on working with them to try to come up with a solution. But I would like to hear any suggestions and a discussion on this if you have any questions. Senator, Did you have one first, Senator Falscato?
I did.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Clay, so then we're not using precinct committee people, so because like a state senate or representative, precinct committee people kind of make that decision. So are in this group selection so that we get all four corners of the state. So is anything within the law saying it must be precinct committee people who are already kind of elected to look at that from the same party that we're replacing?
So, Senator, I'll give you sort of three.
Okay.
So for a state senator, yes, the precinct people vote to fill the vacancy, but if the vacancy happens early enough in the term, then you have a special election at the 2-year mark to finish the last 2 years. For a U.S. congressman, the Constitution says those must be filled by special election immediately. They're just a 2-year term. It's the party district committee, which is a large group, but just from that district, picks the party's candidate. That's a substitute for a primary, and we do a special general election. I believe that the U.S. Senate was, since it was statewide, there you don't have the state committee do it or the precinct leaders. Right now, it's just the governor would select, and this would allow the legislature to give her 3 nominees.
Senator Francisco?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I appreciate this discussion about the timing in terms of an election. I think I would prefer to have a date in the statute rather than say the Secretary of State will determine. I think it would just be easier to say, here's a given date, and I'm hoping that our current Secretary of State can advise us. You know, we just heard that it was one day after that filing deadline. What are the concerns they see in terms of when would they need to know, can people file late and have all that information available for the people voting in the primary?
Clay, I don't know if you have any comment on that, or?
Senator, right now, the default date for county and state senate is 1 May. If the vacancy occurs before 1 May, you go through with a special election. That's 1 May of the second year of a 4-year term. If it happens after 1 May, then it's just filled by precinct leaders and that person finishes the term. That's sort of the default date, but you could pick any date you want as long as it mechanically can, you know, be done, I guess.
Any other questions?
Same issue.
Same issue, yeah.
First day.
There have been a lot of discussion just actually in the last 24 hours about this before we came to committee, because that was the concern that was brought up. And we want to make the best decision we can on what makes sense. And so I think that discussion is going to happen before we work this bill, and you know, we'll try to have a good, robust discussion on that topic so that we get it right. Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I identify with whatever.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I saw the schedule, and we're planning on working this Monday. Is that correct?
I can hold off. We may need a few extra days to make sure that we have a good discussion and see and chat with everybody and see where we get so that we get buy-in on this, because I do want to make a good bill, something that we can rely on, something that Senate can stand behind, because there is a House version, and the House version's a little more expansive, a little more in the weeds. So there's going to be some discussion between the two, so I'd like to get the Senate version right, if we can. Any other questions for Clay? Seeing none, thank you, sir. We appreciate your help. Committee, that is all for today. We will have a hearing on Monday on Senate Bill 65. It's a very short little hearing on an irrigation board election district. And then you may notice on the agenda, we've got a lot of to be announced, because we are awaiting some bill referrals. I do want to give us time to work this, so I'm going to, right after the committee, take a look at how to schedule our agenda for next week. So Appreciate your work, committee. With that, we are